particularly excited about the topic of this workshop. I think it's something that should happen more often, where we get people who study machine learning and people who study human learning to get together. That's something that I do a lot in my research, is try and explore these connections that exist between human and machine learning. And I think in doing that, we might want to think about how it is we go about studying human cognition with a goal of trying to promote a correspondence between what we do when we're making computers do things and what we do when we're trying to understand how people do things. So what I'm going to talk about today is a way of, analyzing cognition that allows us to do this. And this is basically an approach where we go about trying to understand human cognition by focusing on the abstract problems that people solve and thinking about how they might be solved. So I'm having a issue with my, let's see. All right. So the goal is something like, first of all, we think about the computational problems that underlie aspects of human cognition. We find good solutions to those problems. And then we compare how human cognition works to that solution. And the idea is that by doing this, we're setting ourselves up to have a very easy way of going backwards and forwards between cognition and computation. Because in thinking about these good solutions, we're actually going to provide ourselves with connections that go to statistics and computer science and machine learning, where the same kind of problems can have come up, and people will have already thought about or might need to start thinking about ways of going about solving those problems. So this kind of strategy isn't a new strategy for cognitive science. It's something that people have proposed in the past. So this is like David Marr's idea of looking at a computational level of analysis, or Roger Shepard's idea of searching for universal laws that characterize cognition across all organisms, regardless of whether they're human beings or animals or aliens from another planet, looking at the kind of abstract problems that any intelligent system would need to be able to solve, and something that John Anderson calls rational analysis. So the cases that I'm going to talk about today are cases of inductive problems, so problems where we're provided with a small amount of data, and from those data are trying to figure out hypotheses that make sense. So lots of problems in cognitive science fall into the schema, something like learning a language from utterances, where you're provided with utterances that come from a language, and you're trying to figure out something like a grammar that might underlie that. So we have some data that utterances and our hypotheses correspond to the grammars. Something like learning categories from instances of their members, where we get some examples of things that belong to a category, and then we try and figure out what other things might belong to that category. So the data are the examples, and the hypotheses are the category structures. Or, say, learning functions or causal relationships from observations, where you get some information about the values of two variables, and then you're trying to figure out the relationship that might exist between them. So for these kinds of problems, the way that we can think about good solutions to these problems is basically by going to the science of statistics. So if you think about it, statistics is kind of the science of induction. It tells you how much you're justified in concluding about the structure which is underlying the data that you observe. So that's the place where we can go to actually find out how good solutions to these problems work. And in particular, the reason why I'm going to talk about probabilistic models of cognition in this context is because we can use something like Bayesian statistics as giving us a simple theory of learning that we can use to try and understand what people are doing in these tasks. And one way in which this is useful, so everybody I think I'm sure has seen Bayes' rule before, but it tells us how to go from prior probabilities that tell us how much we believe in particular hypotheses before we see data, to posterior probabilities that tell us how much we believe in those hypotheses after seeing data, combining this with a likelihood that tells us how likely the data were given the particular hypothesis. And so this gives us a way of modeling all sorts of things that are relevant to understanding human cognition. So our success in those inductive problems partly comes from having good constraints on learning. So we have good expectations about the kinds of things that we're going to see, or we have other kinds of factors which mean that we're not going to consider all of the arbitrary hypotheses, but there's going to be some kind of structure in the hypotheses that we consider. And so by doing things like having a prior distribution over hypotheses, we're able to capture what those constraints are, and we can begin to build up models which tell us something about what it is that people know that we might want to be able to generalize over to computers. And this is a little like what Michael was talking about. It seemed like maybe you have a more structured hypothesis space or more sort of prior information which is informing your learning, which was making you able to do those reinforcement learning problems. So pursuing this strategy in cognitive science has led to a number of kind of correspondences that exist between, on the one hand, human learning, and on the other hand, machine learning, where we take a problem which is something which we want to understand about how human cognition works, and we think about what the underlying statistical problem might be. So for all of the problems on the left-hand side, there's sort of corresponding problems that people solve in machine learning, and you can establish a very simple kind of vocabulary for translating backwards and forwards. So when somebody makes an advance in machine learning, it gives us something that we can use to understand human learning. And the models we've looked at in human learning are things that have interpretations in terms of machine learning. So the idea is that, at the end of the day, we're going to be able to take some ideas from machine learning and use them to build new models of human learning, trying to understand what it is that people are doing, but also maybe take some inspiration from human learning and come up with new machine learning systems. And here, the idea is that we can either find new problems that people solve, that they solve in ways that aren't necessarily the ways which machine learning algorithms solve them, or they're problems that people haven't necessarily thought about in the context of machine learning. So what I'm going to do today is talk about 3 examples from this list, just to illustrate how this kind of approach can work. I'll talk about categorization, where the corresponding machine learning problem is a problem of density estimation. I'll talk about learning features of objects, where there's a corresponding problem of dimensionality reduction. And then at the end, I'll talk about how it is that we can use some of the methods that come from machine learning as tools for thinking in a different way about how we design experiments. So the first 2 of these examples are going to use the kind of tools coming from non-parametric Bayesian statistics that Mike was talking about yesterday. So this is part of the inspiration for choosing these particular topics to talk about. So I'll start with categorization. So I think everybody in the room is familiar with the standard sort of categorization problem. So I could give you an example of members of 2 different categories, say dogs and cats, and then I show you a new object, and I want you to classify whether that's a dog or a cat. You can think about how you're going to do that. It looks kind of cat-like, but it's probably a dog. And a basic question that we can ask is how it is that people represent these categories. So what it is that you're doing when you're making that kind of decision. And the psychological literature has provided us with a bunch of different theories about how this might work. So one of these theories is the idea that the way we represent categories is in terms of having prototypes. So we might have a bunch of examples of members of a category we've seen, and from these we abstract some kind of canonical kind of representation for what, say, a cat is. And then when we're making a decision as to whether something belongs to the category, then they are going to measure how close it is to that prototype, and then compare it to how close it is to prototypes of other categories. And so the challenge here is learning what the prototype of a category might be.
And also the distance, how do you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Another approach would be something like an exemplar model, where instead of storing individual instances of instead of checking a prototype, we store every single instance of a cat that we might have seen before. And so now this gives us a sort of pretty simple algorithm for figuring out whether something's a cat. You compare it to all of the cats that you've seen, and then to all of the members of other categories, and you sort of figure out which of the categories it's closest to on average. It gives you an extra challenge, though, in terms of having to store lots and lots of examples in memory. And there are also strategies that correspond to something in between. So you might recognize that some of these cats kind of fall into natural subcategories, this kind of fluffy cats and maybe sort of gray cats, and then you sort of cluster those ones together and might have a prototype for each of those subclusters, and then you can use your prototype model. You're going to now compare to each of the prototypes for the category, and you don't have to represent every single instance of the ones that you've seen before, but it gives you a way of kind of compromising between those 2. So these are psychological theories in the sense that they're kind of theories that come out of thinking about how human memory might work and the kinds of processes that might be involved in categorization. But we can ask some questions about this from the perspective of thinking about human cognition in terms of abstract computational problems that I was talking about. So one question is whether we can actually think about these approaches to categorization as something which we can understand as a rational solution to an underlying computational problem. And in this case, the first thing we have to do is think about how we want to formalize this computational problem of categorization. And there are lots of ways of doing this. So I'm going to talk about one way, but there are other ways which are basically equivalent. The way that I'm going to formulate this is as a sort of classic inductive problem within the scope of Bayesian statistics, where we'll assume that we get some data, some stimuli, say x. So x is going to represent the properties of that particular object. And then we have some hypotheses. Well, our hypotheses correspond to the categories C that those observations can be drawn from. And then we're just going to use Bayes' rule to work out the probability that a particular stimulus comes from a particular category. So we need some prior probability of the different categories, and we also need to have a likelihood which tells us the probability of particular stimuli being generated from particular categories.
No, but in the earlier case, when you showed 3 possible type of prototype versus maybe a sampler or somewhere, all you need to do is that just take the distance, the sequences are close to each other. You don't need to always compare.
So I'm just saying. So I said there are lots of equivalent ways of formulating this. So another equivalent way that you can do this is you can say you just want to estimate something like the boundaries between things, or you want to, and so those will fall out of this, right? So making different kinds of assumptions about the likelihood will correspond to different kinds of models that you could end up defining. And I can talk more about that if you're curious. Okay. So in order to be able to apply Bayes' rule, right, it's very simple once we know what these probability distributions are, but we need to know what these probability distributions are. And so that's why the problem of learning categories reduces to one of density estimation, right? So what we have to do is to estimate some probability distributions. We have to know the prior probability, but the more tricky part is figuring out, well, how do we represent the probability of different objects given that they come from particular categories? If you look in the statistical literature, there are two kinds of approaches you can take to estimating those distributions. A parametric approach, where we define some parametric family and then we estimate a distribution within that family, or a non-parametric approach, where we take a strategy which is going to yield for us an estimate which will apply for any family that we want to be learning about without making restrictive assumptions about the form of that distribution. And it's a kind of well-known fact in the categorization literature that these correspond to prototype and exemplar models. So roughly, parametric density estimation, if we assume that the category has a simple form where there are some parameters theta, and those parameters indicate basically the prototype structure, then we get something which is equivalent to a kind of prototype model. So here the idea is that, you know, if we define our probability distribution over X so that there's some central tendency and then the probability decreases as we get away from that, then the way you're going to end up categorizing is by similarity to that central tendency, right, by the distance that you're away from it. Non-parametric density estimation, the standard kind of non-parametric density estimator is a kernel density estimator, where for each of our observations, we put down a little kernel, a little bit of probability mass over that kernel. And then from that, we sort of estimate our probability distribution by adding up those individual little kernels. So that gives us a mixture distribution that approximates our target distribution. And this is something which corresponds to an exemplar model in the sense that we're kind of getting, you can think about this little bit of probability as like a similarity function. And then the global similarity function for that category is the one which we get by adding all of those up. So if you say, I'm going to calculate the similarity to a category by adding up the similarity to all of the exemplars in that category, what you're doing is the equivalent of getting out the probability distribution, which you would get by doing kernel density estimation. And then, you know, something in between, well, if we use, say, just a mixture distribution, where now we're willing to cluster together some of our observations into separate mixture components, and then we add up those mixture components for each of our categories, then that's going to be something where we have a bit of both of these things, right? So here we got a component corresponding to each of those subclusters represented by parameters that correspond to its own prototype. So that means that we can think about all of these different kinds of approaches as, you know, rational solutions to these computational problems, but that doesn't necessarily, you know, give us a good way of understanding sort of which of these things people might, you know, should do in the sense of trying to solve this problem. We still have another problem then that comes up, which is asking, well, if there are all of these different strategies, which approach should people be using when they're learning categories? And in thinking about this, there are sort of advantages and disadvantages that come up for these different kinds of approaches. So basically, they both have strengths and weaknesses. Parametric density estimation requires less data because you're just trying to estimate a couple of parameters, but it's severely constrained in the distributions you can estimate. Non-parametric estimation requires a lot of data to get a good estimate, but it can get a good estimate for any kind of density, right? So this is a kind of trade-off. It's a classic kind of trade-off that we see in statistics, a kind of bias variance trade-off. But, you know, maybe there's a way to get around this. And one sort of idea that we can get from thinking about this as a statistical estimation problem is maybe we could think about this rather than saying what's going on is people have some fixed representation, prototypes or exemplars or something in between, and saying instead, maybe what learners should try and do is adaptively select a representation which is going to make sense given the amount of data that they've seen and the kind of structure that's expressed in those data. Yeah?
Have you considered using Griffiths on this mixture distribution?
Well, I think so. That's an alternative kind of non-parametric method. I don't think it necessarily corresponds to anything in the psychological literature. Okay, so then, if that's true, which approach we should use is going to depend on the form of the category being learned and what data we've seen. Now we have a new problem, which is figuring out how we should go about choosing that representation. So in the psychological literature, there's actually a nice model which begins to answer this question that adaptively chooses a representation based on the structure of the data that it's seen. And this is Anderson's rational model of categorization. So the basic idea in Anderson's model It says, let's just treat the category labels as any other feature. So we're going to think about our observations as being some vector of features plus a category label. And then we'll define a joint distribution on these features, including the category label, using a mixture model, where we break the objects up into clusters, and for each of those clusters we learn some parameters representing that cluster. But now we're going to allow the number of clusters to vary. And the way that we do this is by defining a prior distribution over clusters, which says that the probability that we choose a particular cluster is proportional to the number of things that belong to that cluster, provided that cluster has been seen before in the data, and with some probability is going to be a new cluster. So this isn't exactly how it was expressed in Anderson's model, but it's a little bit of an algebraic manipulation, and once you see that, then you'll recognize this from the talks you've seen before. So Anderson actually independently came up with a Dirichlet process mixture model. And this is actually, kind of an impressive intellectual achievement. So he derived this from basically symmetry considerations and derived the Chinese restaurant process. He didn't know anything about the corresponding literature and statistics. So we subsequently exploited that connection to come up with better algorithms for doing things like working in Anderson's model. But it also points to the fact that maybe we can come up with a more extensive kind of correspondence between the psychological literature and the machine learning literature by building on this correspondence between Anderson's model and a Dirichlet process mixture model. So the basic idea is that maybe we can think about coming up with a model which allows us to express these different kinds of assumptions you can have about the representation you should form for a category. The density estimation here gives us a unifying framework in the sense of a way of thinking about the problem being solved, but each of the models I've talked about represent different kind of strategies for solving that problem. So we can go beyond this by having a unifying model, which would be a model of how you can estimate probabilities or how you could learn categories, of which all of these other models fall out as special cases. And then the idea is that learners can adopt different representations by adaptively selecting between these cases in a way that's motivated by the structure of the data. And we can do this by taking another sort of idea from the machine learning literature, the idea of a hierarchical Dirichlet process. So Mike kind of showed you a very abstract picture of how this works. A more concrete just sort of illustration of this, just using that Chinese restaurant franchise, would be to say that we've got two categories, A and B. Then the way that we decide prior distribution over the probability that we get an object from a particular cluster in each of those categories is we look at how many times a cluster has been used in that category in the past, and then we have some probability determined by the parameter alpha, which indicates the probability with which we're going to generate a new cluster. But then when we make a decision to generate a new cluster, what we do is we go up to a higher level process. This is the place where you order out the food that's delivered to all of your different Chinese restaurants. And then in that higher level process, we've got information about which clusters have been used in the past, and some of these clusters have been used by category A, some of these clusters have been used by category B, and there's a second parameter which determines the probability of generating something that's a completely new cluster that we've never seen before. So the idea here is that these two parameters, alpha and gamma, are going to describe two different properties that this process can have. So as gamma gets larger, it's going to become more likely that there are independent clusters between the two groups, right? Because you're going to be more likely to generate a completely new thing. As alpha becomes larger, it's going to become more likely that you're going to have many clusters within a group, right? And so by varying those parameters, you can vary the amount of correlation that exists between categories and the amount of clustering that you expect to see in the data. So those two parameters actually give us what we want in terms of having a model which allows us to represent all of these different kinds of alternatives to categorization. So I'm going to show you this schematically in a diagram. So I'm going to show you some little pictures where a white circle is a cluster, a black circle is an exemplar, and a box is a category. So for example, something like this, where these are three categories, each of which contains three exemplars, and then each of those exemplars belongs to its own cluster, is something which corresponds to an exemplar model, where we have a separate distribution for each of those. And that's something that we get out when we take the value of gamma in the limit as it becomes large, and alpha in the limit as it becomes large, then we're generating a new cluster for every observation, and those clusters are unique. A prototype model corresponds to the case as alpha becomes small and gamma becomes large, and then this is going to be a case where we're going to have separate clusters across categories, but say only one cluster within each category, because you're going to be unlikely to make new ones. Then Anderson's model is something that falls down here, where we're going to have clusters that are shared across categories, and there's some probability that we're going to generate more than one cluster for each of those observations. And then there are other weird models in here, like this is one which has a prototype model, but it assumes that the prototype can be the same across two categories, as well as interesting models like this one, which says basically the way we're going to represent a category is by clusters that are independent between categories, that the number of categories can vary. And this one which says that we're going to have shared clusters that exist between categories, and then those clusters are things which can be influential on multiple categories at once. So these different models actually give us a way of thinking about capturing these different kinds of representations we could end up using. So if we use one of these models which is relatively free to vary in its parameters, so this is the most flexible, this is the one which can kind of adaptively choose what kind of representation it wants, or even this one is something which is a step between exemplar and prototype, where it can decide whether it wants to use a prototype-like representation or something that's more like an exemplar-like representation. It gives us the opportunity to talk about how a learner could go about selecting a representation that's appropriate for the data that they see. So we can illustrate this using a data set where it seems like there's a change that happens in the kind of representation that people use. So I'm going to call the model we're using here HTP plus infinity. That just means that the alpha parameter is somewhere between 0 and infinity, and we actually estimate that from the data. And the gamma parameter is fixed at infinity, which means that there's no sharing of clusters between categories. So this model is the one that was on the right-hand side of the middle. It'll automatically infer a representation using prototypes, exemplars, or something in between, and it'll estimate how far in between it should be from the data. And what we do is test this on a data set where it's a data set that almost supports a prototype representation. So these are members of category A represented as bit vectors, where the bits correspond to the features that you can see. And if you look at this, you can kind of see there's a lot of consistency in the features that of objects that belong to category A, and a lot of consistency in the features of objects that belong to category B. But then there are these exceptions down here. So what this suggests is a representation where you want to represent it not just with a prototype, you want to have, because you want to recognize that there are these exceptions, and representing it using all exemplars is kind of wasteful because there actually is this regularity in the data. So if you look at the human data, what you see is that initially people, so the little triangles here correspond to those exception stimuli. These are the other stimuli. This is showing over time the probability that a particular observation gets classified to category A. So initially people start acting in a way which is like a prototype model, in that they're classifying the exceptions in the same direction as the other members of the other things which have the same kind of features. And that's what you do if you use a prototype model. At the end of learning, they're classifying them correctly, which suggests that they formed a separate representation for those exceptions.
So what data is it? Is it cat and dog data? Or?
So yeah, it's something like that. They show people basically these stimuli which vary, like I think they use bugs which vary in different features that they can have. Yeah, and then they're learning from those visual features. They're forming these cats.
So I know some literature about language acquisition where they see whether human memorize the whole pronunciation, the whole word, or forming.
Right.
That is similar kind of.
Yeah, so this kind of rule. Well, there's a large literature on kind of rule and exception learning, and in this case, there's not a simple rule because those are family resemblance categories. There's no one feature you can point to as being the right thing. So then it ends up being kind of prototype plus exception learning in this case. But yeah, there's a similar kind of literature. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Right.
We probably use the reaction time to measure how human.
Well, you can use the accuracy as well in this case because it's informative about the representation of it. Okay. Yep. Okay. So, oops. Let's see. All right. So the prototype model, if you just try and estimate a prototype, it's going to do the wrong thing here, right? It's going to put those exceptions with the rest of the category members. And that corresponds to the prototype model in the family of models that I showed you before. If you use an exemplar model, then it always thinks that you should represent these as different, so because it sort of figures out that's the way you should do it. But if you use something like the hierarchical Dirichlet process, what happens is it starts out kind of having evidence for it likes to represent the data with as few clusters as possible, but as you accumulate evidence, it becomes clearer that there's a separate cluster that exists in the data, and as a consequence of that, it ends up doing this kind of crossover in the way that the human learners do. And so if we look at how well these things fit the data in terms of log likelihood, this hierarchical Dirichlet process is the one that actually gives us the best representation. So one way of thinking about this is that what's going on here is rational representational change, where based on the data that you see, you're going to choose to form one representation rather than the other, rather than these kind of debates that happen in cognitive science where it's people say, oh, it's this representation or it's this representation. I think this gives us a constructive way of thinking about the problem in terms of thinking about what an adaptive learner should do in terms of changing representation to match the structure of the data.
Just a point of clarification.
Yeah.
Those meta parameters, the gamma and alpha, do you just fix those ahead of time, or are these learned?
So they're learned by, gamma is fixed at infinity, meaning that we're not going to allow clusters between categories. But here, alpha is estimated by posterior inference. Yeah. Okay. So, and that's not looking at that's not fitting the data. It's just posterior inference from the data. But perhaps a more exciting model is this model, in which we allow both of those parameters to vary, because now it allows clusters to share between categories. And that's actually something that's nice because it gives us a way in which learning categories can help you learn categories in the future. So you could think about an example like this. If you learn the category of cats, you might learn within that there's a cluster corresponding to stripy cats. And then if you go on and learn something about stripy objects, then having a cluster that corresponds to stripy cats is going to be useful in doing that, because if you know that this is a stripy object, then you'll know that all of those other things are stripy objects too. And so what we're doing in the lab at the moment is testing out whether this kind of transfer learning is something which we observe in human learners too. So trying to teach people new category representations where it's useful to form these kind of intermediate representations and use those in generalizing in the future. So a second example where we can use the same kind of non-parametric Bayesian technology is a case of trying to learn features from data. So in that example, I was assuming that you already have a way of encoding what the features are of objects, and you can use that encoding to figure out, all you have to do is estimate a probability distribution. But in reality, the way that we represent the world is much more flexible than that. So most of our models assume that we have a fixed set of abstract features, but here's an object, tell me what its features are, right? More than and make a question of analysis. If I show you this object in the context of feedback, you might have a better idea of what you want to code for that feature. So the way we do this experiment is we tell people these are inscriptions that the Mars rover found in a cave. And
each of those little dots, does that represent an exemplar in some feature space?
No, each of the dots represents, so each of the images is a single exemplar, and the dots are just random noise.
So the dots have nothing to do with the
That's because the Mars rover doesn't have a very good camera. Yeah. Okay, so if you think these are Martian inscriptions, you can think about how you would organize your expectations about these, and contrast that with something like this.
Why did you put plots around that one?
That's the one that you saw before. I'm just picking it out.
It's not like the prototype or something.
No, so that's the one I'm asking you to think about how you'd represent, and then think about how it would change based on those different contexts. Do you want me to go back to the other one? So the idea is that
the individual, not the class.
Yeah.
So that whole left column looks really similar to me.
so that left column is similar in that they're identical copies. This should be kind of jumbled up. But, so the idea is that if you see something like this, then the things that vary among these images are basically just these little top bits, and there's only 4 different kinds of top bits, right? So then,
But I can't distinguish the things in the left column, so I'm going to struggle with that.
yeah, that's right. So we can make it noisier for you. But so in our experiments, we tell people that they're unique. So you could contrast it with something like this. Now, if you look at these carefully, the features that you want to encode here are different in that it doesn't. There's nothing. Now you've got this top bit. That's the only one that has a top bit like that. So that's no longer really necessarily as useful. But you can recognize. Look, these two have this bit that seems to be in common, right? And then you see something like this here as well. And if you keep looking at it, you can kind of figure out actually. There are some basic parts that it makes sense to identify here that are different from the ones that you saw in the previous image. So the question is how it is that you end up doing that. So how it is that the kind of statistical information that you have about the variation in parts is something that we can explain, how it is you're able to use that in learning. And one of the challenges here is that the number of features that you want to learn is something that is not necessarily known. So in the previous slide, you wanted to have 4 features. Here, it turns out you probably want to have 6 features. So how do you decide what representation you should be using, and how do you figure out what dimensionality that representation should have? So we can solve this problem as a kind of matrix factorization problem, or a dimensionality reduction problem, where we think about the data as something which is represented, where we might think about this as a matrix, where we have every row corresponds to an object, and every column corresponds to one of the sort of pixels in those images, or primitive perceptual properties that you can read off, or activation of cells in your retina, or something like that. Just the most basic representation you could adopt for those objects. And you can think about generating that matrix as the consequence of multiplying together 2 other matrices. So one is a matrix which tells us for every object what sort of these features are, and the other one is a matrix which tells us for those features how it is that those features map into the perceptual space in which we've encoded things. And if you multiply those 2 things together, then you get back information which has the same dimensionality as that original matrix, but now we have the option to figure out, okay, maybe there are fewer features that we can use to encode the perceptual properties that appear in those matrices.
So what do you use this kind of features? I mean, if I look at those original data, I would think that our trapezoid is always there.
Yeah.
And that becomes the common structure.
Right. That's right.
So where does that enter into this?
So that enters in, it can be a feature which is always on for all of your objects, or it could be something which is a separate bias.
But there's a possibility that certain part of this,
yeah.
They can block, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And somehow you have to infer.
Yeah, so you can, so the way that we do this is to say that, so all you have to do is just to say that you've got a basic bias term which is added to each of those elements in the matrix, right? And then that'll allow you to capture things that are constant. Okay, so in particular, for the data that I showed you, I was just showing you little black and white images, and there we can build a model which just uses basically, ones and zeros to encode the structure of those images. And this is why I'm saying binary matrix factorization, because now we're going to have one binary matrix which represents which features the objects possess, and another binary matrix which determines how those features map into the perceptual space. And we need to have a likelihood function that takes us from these matrices to that matrix, and we do this using a noisy OR distribution, and that's just what's written up here. It says that basically what we do in order to calculate something happened to my slides again. So in order to calculate let's see. Okay. I'm going to give up. This is worse. Okay, I'll leave it alone. So in order to calculate let's see, if I go this. Okay. In order to calculate the probability of an observation being 1, what we do is we take the inner product between the features of that object and how those features are weighted on that particular perceptual dimension, and then we basically add up how many features point to that dimension and influence that dimension, and then we give each of those features an independent opportunity to turn on that bit in the image. But the question that we end up with is the question of how it is that we should go about inferring the number of features that we want to use, because this is going to be important in determining what kind of representation we're going to adopt. Okay, so we can take a non-parametric approach to this. We assume the number of features is unbounded, but only a finite number will be expressed in any finite data set. That's this non-parametric approach that Mike was talking about, and in fact we can use the Indian buffet process to give us a prior distribution on this matrix Z. So the Indian buffet process gives us a distribution on matrices with a fixed number of rows and an unbounded number of columns, and as a consequence we can use posterior inference to figure out how many columns we need, identify not just what the features of the objects are, but how many features we need in order to encode the data. So when we do this using these different sets of objects as input, then we get out representations that look like this. So for these ones we get out something where this comes out as a kind of constant property of the image, but then we get variation corresponding to these 4 different kinds of things that could appear on top. So we get an encoding which captures the fact that there's variation along those dimensions. If we do it on something like this, we actually get out 6 features, and so these 6 features correspond to the different parts that are put together in order to compose each of those original objects. So it gives us a way of extracting those features from the the visual data.
Two bases up there, they're actually different?
So that just happens, that's a bug in the algorithm, basically. It's a local maximum. So what happens is there's a lot of pixels in here, and so what it's doing is explaining it has very slightly different bases for some of these features, and so if you've got enough of them, then you can explain enough data that you're able to have one base rather than the other. So if you find a global maximum, then it would only have those two combined together, but just using our approximate search procedure, it already does a pretty good job of figuring out that there's a different kind of representation you should be using for these different sets of objects.
So at the end, each sample now is represented by a vector.
Each of our objects is now represented by a small vector. So in this case, the vector has
6 component vector.
So and then here it's got.
That feature is there, then you put one in one. Other one.
So it's like learning a binary code for those images, and then it can reproduce the images just using that binary code. So it's a very high.
The prototype, each kind of prototype feature, then you get combination.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And they're just sort of essentially linearly combined in order to produce the objects. So this is a very simple example of something that's done in a much more sophisticated way in machine learning, where people want to take images of faces and find lower dimensional representation, or other kinds of images too.
Can the number of features be larger than the dimensionality of the image?
Yeah. So there's no bound in terms of the prior distribution, but the way that it's set up, the number of features under the prior grows as it's a Poisson distribution, where it's the number of objects times the nth harmonic number is the expectation. So the prior determines how many features you expect, but there's nothing which means that you can't have more features than you have observed dimensions. So you can get an over-complete representation. There's no constraint that means that doesn't happen. We actually did an experiment testing out whether this is what happens with our human learners. So what we do is show people, we tell them these are objects that came, were discovered by the images, there were inscriptions in a cave that were discovered by the Mars rover, and we ask them to make predictions about, what other kinds of inscriptions they think are in the cave. So we train them either on a set where they get these little images on cards and they can go through them, and they either get the correlated set, which corresponds to the first set that I showed you, where we've got just these 4 different kinds that vary, or what we call a factorial set, where now you get all possible combinations of features. So these two sets actually use the same basic features. It's just that what we've done here is chosen a set of 3 features and repeated those 3 features for 4 objects. And those are chosen in a way such that those features are more correlated by the fact that they appear in more objects together than they would be if they were generated independently. So the statistical cue that the model is picking up on is that there's a correlation between these features here, and there's no such correlation here because we're just generating those features independently. And then when we test people, we show them 3 data sets. We show them one set which consists of 4 objects that they've actually seen already, and so these are 4 objects corresponding to the correlated set, but are also contained in the factorial set. We show them 4 objects which they haven't seen before, and these correspond to the 4 objects that can be made by factorial combinations of these original features, but weren't included in the factorial set. So there's actually 20 that you can get by taking 3 sets of 3 features from our set 6. And we show them some which are made of shuffled bits of features, which are sort of trying to give us a control in terms of determining things that people have never seen before and shouldn't say something that actually exists. Yeah?
So these features are built from the original features that you had that were the base features?
Yeah.
Are the base features just pixels, or are they somehow also parts themselves that have been somehow glued together?
Yeah, so they've been glued together. So what we did in terms of selecting those features was try and use things. I can try and show you. Let's see. Okay, we tried to use things that were they were all connected shapes, and then any combination of 3 was always connected to the base. So there's a little bit of there's an interesting question about how you can use prior knowledge about what kinds of things are likely to be features, and in our model, that's prior knowledge which comes out in terms of the prior distribution on this part of the model. So here we actually assume a priori those features are just independent pixels, but that's obviously wrong, and there are lots of perceptual cues that people use in terms of figuring out the parts of objects. Okay, so let's see. So when we do this experiment, what we find is that if you show people those factorial cards, then they generalize to the objects which use the same features, and if you show them the correlated cards, then they don't. You actually get this interesting bump where you basically get exactly the same responses in terms of how likely you would be to see this thing in the cave for the factorial cards to any of the cards that they've seen and the cards that they haven't seen. Whereas for the correlated cards, there's actually, you get a higher rate. People are really, really sure that you're going to see more of those things. And that comes out of the model as well, because if you think about what it's doing, it's estimating not just what the features are, but how likely those feature combinations are. And so the feature combination, which corresponds to one of those correlated things, is going to have higher probability than just if you took independent combinations of the other features. So we get a very nice correspondence between the judgments that people make here and the predictions that come out of that kind of model. And we're now doing experiments where we use more complicated kinds of features, so things that apply that are basically continuous features on three-dimensional objects that are more realistic in terms of the kind of learning problem that people have to solve, as well as looking at how things like category information interact with the judgments that people make about whether things belong to whether things are features. So you can think about it, if you're learning categories, then one thing that you can learn is that a particular feature is diagnostic of membership in one category or not. So even if that's not something you'd necessarily picked out, just as a consequence of the variation in the data, it's something that can end up being a good kind of cue to category membership, and as a consequence, a good thing to represent. And you can get that out of these same kind of probabilistic models too. Okay, so the last example I wanted to go through is one where we're not explicitly trying to make probabilistic models of cognition, but we're trying to use probabilistic models as a tool for investigating aspects of human learning. And the idea here is roughly that in all of these other kinds of contexts where we've been making these models, we're making an assumption that basically people are like little statistical engines, right? That they've got probability distributions inside their heads, and those probability distributions are the things that are guiding their responses. But if that's true, then maybe we can treat people like probability distributions in terms of the way we do experiments. Maybe we can use some of the methodology that we're used to using for sampling from probability distributions in machine learning and statistics as a tool for designing experiments that provide us with information about psychological representations. So basically the idea is that many psychological quantities we might want to learn about are things you can express as a non-negative function over a set of objects. So probability distributions, utilities you might assign, similarities between objects, strength of association or strength of a trace in memory, and research in machine learning and statistics gives us tools that we can use for sampling from complex probability distributions. So like Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms, which give us a way of defining a Markov chain which is going to converge to a particular distribution. So maybe we can put these two together and design experiments that are based on the kind of methodology that underlies Markov chain Monte Carlo. So the basic Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm that people use is called the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm. And the way that it defines this Markov chain is that it breaks the transition process into two steps. The first step, we propose a state, which is a variation on the current state that we see. And we do this by choosing some probability distribution. Here I've called it Q. And I'm going to assume that this probability distribution is something which is symmetrical. So the chance of going from one state to a particular proposed state is the same as going from that proposed state back to that original state. Then the second thing we do is make a decision as to whether we want to accept that proposal. And the canonical way of doing this is using the Metropolis acceptance function, which says that we accept that state for sure if the proposal has higher probability under the distribution we want to converge to, and otherwise we accept it with probability based on the ratio of those probabilities, of the proposed state and the current state that we're at. So if something's got higher probability, we're definitely going to go there. If it's got lower probability, we might still go there. But it's a chancy thing. But the way that this works is that it constructs a Markov chain where if you sort of think about it intuitively, you're going to be more likely to go in directions which are going to correspond to parts of the space which are higher probability. You'll spend more time in those regions, and ultimately you'll converge to a distribution over states which corresponds to this distribution P. But mathematically, the way that this works is by satisfying a property of Markov chains called detailed balance. And there are other choices that you can make at this point in terms of defining your acceptance function that will also satisfy detailed balance. And one of these is something called the Barker acceptance function. It's something which is less efficient than the Metropolis function, but it has a simpler form. There's no mins and maxes and so on. What it does is say you transition to that state with probability which is proportional to the probability of the proposal relative to the probability of the current state. So you just take the ratio of probability of the proposal to probability of proposal plus the probability of the current state. So intuitively, the way that these algorithms work, they'll start out at some point. Here's our point. They have some distribution that we want to converge to P. We'll make a proposal around that. We'll sample a point from that proposal. We evaluate the relative probability of those two. And then we make a decision as to accept that or not. If we accept it, we move. If we reject it, we stay. And then we do the same thing again. We make a new proposal. We evaluate the probability and compute an acceptance function on the basis of that. In this case, we're going to decide to move there. And in general, we're going to move more in this region and more in this region and more in this region. And over time, that process is going to visit states with probability proportional to their probability under this distribution P. So a simple way of turning this into a psychological algorithm is to observe that the only part that the probability distribution P plays is in that acceptance function. So you can generate proposals and so on and so on and so on. The only role the thing that determines what distribution you converge to is the process by which you're deciding whether to accept a proposal or not. So this gives us then a way that we could go about sampling subjective quantities. If we really think that those are things that are inside people's heads, then if we want to generate information about this particular non-negative quantity f of x, if people's choices are things which are proportional to that non-negative quantity, then this actually satisfies the criteria for the Barker acceptance rule for a probability distribution p of x which is proportional to f of x. So it gives us a way of defining a Markov chain where people basically are presented with objects and variations on those objects. They make a two-alternative forced choice, and then we do it again, and then we do it again, and then we do it again. And what we should end up converging to is a probability distribution which is proportional to the probabilities that we would get if we were choosing things according to this function f of x.
Could you also apply this to the Metropolis rule?
So the problem is that you want, we assume that this is what we're getting out of people. So the question is, is there a choice rule that people use that corresponds to a valid acceptance rule for the MCMC algorithm? Yeah. And so the Metropolis rule isn't something which is like that. And there's a literature sort of that uses this rule for modeling, although there are also more complex choice models that we can talk about some more that we're sort of starting to look at now. Okay. So here's a simple example. This example of categorization where using that choice rule is actually extremely common. So the idea is that if we have a category like, say, frogs, represented by a subjective probability distribution P of x given C, then the probability that people would choose, say, x1 when we ask them which of these animals is a frog might be something which is proportional to the probability of the object that they're evaluating x1 under the category compared to the probability of the other object under that category. And you can give a little Bayesian derivation for why you should do this. And it's essentially, in this case, assuming probability matching between the posterior probability and the choice probabilities. So the way we then run our algorithm is we show people two objects, we say which is the frog, they pick one, and then we accumulate a response in favor of that stimulus. We then show the stimulus that they've selected and a variation on that, and we ask them which is the frog, they pick one, and then we accumulate. And then we show them that object and a variation on it, we say which is the frog, they pick one, and we accumulate, and we continue to do this again and again and again. So we've done a lot of experiments testing this out. Some of those experiments are just sort of basic validation of why this method works, showing that we can recover particular distributions from human learners. But we've also done more interesting things where we try and examine, say, natural categories that people have formed through experience with the world. So an example of this would be something like categories of animals. And the way we do this is using a 9-dimensional state space corresponding to angles and lengths of the parts of a little quadrupedal stick figure. So it can vary in the angle of the head, the angle of the neck, the length of its nose, the tilt of its body, and so on. And then we looked at categories of giraffes, horses, cats, and dogs. So the idea would be that you do this experiment. If we show you these, we say which is a giraffe, or which looks more like a giraffe, or which is a better example of a giraffe. They'd make a choice, and then we'd record that choice and continue. It's okay if you choose randomly here. These are pretty close to your giraffe prototype, and that's what you should do according to that choice rule. So what we see, so this is showing samples from a single subject where we've taken that 9-dimensional space and projected it down to a 2-dimensional space. Here are 3 giraffe chains that were started at different locations, and this is what you would hope to see if you're running a microchain Monte Carlo algorithm. What happens is, pretty quickly, those chains come together on a particular part of the space and then just walk around in that part of the space. If we go and look at what that part of the space is, it corresponds to things that look like this. So it's good. Those look like giraffes. And then the other categories from the subject are, here this is dogs, cats, and horses, and you can see a few examples from the samples that were produced by those subjects. And so we're doing a pretty good job of actually getting things that look dog-like, cat-like, and horse-like, and so on. And you can also see things about the amount of variability which is allowed in those different categories along these dimensions.
The subject already know the categories?
Yeah. We tell them giraffe, horse, cat, dog when they're making those judgments. in this experiment, they actually did them on different days. So they came in and they had a giraffe day, and then they came in and had a horse day, and then they had a cat day. And that actually, we decided in the end wasn't a good idea, because I'll show you. These are the estimates that we get from, these are the mean animals, by which I mean the average animals, not nasty animals. When we average over the microchain Monte Carlo samples from each subject, discarding a burn-in for each one, but you can see we get sort of giraffe things, horsey things, cats, and dogs. So I think by having people have a separate day for each animal, that meant that it was possible for, say, subject number 5 to produce things that always look kind of giraffe-like. So, because there wasn't really like a lot of contrast in the way that they were using those dimensions. So, you know, but the other subjects all seem to do a pretty good job of differentiating the different categories. I'm a bit worried about subject number 5, actually. But the thing that you get from this isn't just the average of the categories, you also get marginal densities. So you can work out what features are diagnostic of category membership. So this is showing for those 9 dimensions, foot spread, body height, body tilt, tail length, tail angle, neck angle, head length, and head angle, what the marginal distributions look like for each of those different categories. So you might be surprised by this, but giraffes actually have long necks, right? So this red curve here represents giraffe neck length. But actually, it's kind of interesting. One thing that you might not have thought about is that dogs have longer necks than cats. Okay, that's actually a diagnostic feature for something being a dog. Another example is cats have longer tails than dogs. So this is cat tails. These are dog tails, is the pink one here. And there are other sorts of interesting things here, like dogs have longer snouts than cats, and cats are the only ones who are likely to have their tails point right up in the air. So here, this is cats and dogs. So cats are most likely to have a tail that goes right up. So, you know, there's a lot of information that we're gathering about these dimensions and how it is that these dimensions are stochastically related to category membership. Okay, so the basic kind of argument that I wanted to make in terms of showing you these examples is the idea that we can make progress in understanding cognitive problems by thinking about them as computational problems, and that's something that actually facilitates the kind of interaction that we're trying to have here between machine learning on the one hand and cognitive learning science on the other hand, where if we can think about, you know, these abstract problems as the way we're going to develop our theories, that sets us up to be able to exchange ideas between those disciplines. Machine learning gives us some of the tools we need to understand human learning, and I think cognitive science can give us some insight about maybe the biases which guide human learning. So an example here is one thing we're doing now is using that MCMC method to gather much more information about the structure of human categories for a variety of different categories that can then be used as something that you can use for input to a machine learning system that'll be able to, you know, learn those things and make similar kinds of generalizations. But it also gives us a nice source of new sorts of problems to solve, thinking about the kinds of properties that human learners have and then thinking about machine learning algorithms for solving those problems. So I didn't mention this, but the way that we actually came up with the Indian buffet process, which is used now in machine learning, was by thinking about this kind of problem that came up in cognitive science. And so for me at least, cognitive science and human learning provides me with inspiration for thinking about how to solve some new and interesting statistical problems. So thank you.
Can you go back to one of the slides where you show memory and search that you skip?
Yeah. So you're asking what's the correspondence?
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of interesting things. So Mark Stivers, who's a faculty member here, he's not here this morning, but he was around yesterday. So he and I have done some experiments looking at this. So there are basically 2 aspects of search which are interestingly related to human memory. One is a kind of something that's related to semantic memory, just kind of, you know, interpreting queries and doing information retrieval. And we've shown that probabilistic topic models like the latent Dirichlet allocation model give us, better predictions of human semantic memory than existing proposals about how to do that. The other part is a part which is more about how you organize facts in memory. So if you think about it, like the traditional way of thinking about memory is that we've got, like, it's kind of like a bookshelf that's this long and you've only got so many slots, and once you put something on you have to take something off and then you've forgotten it. But in fact, another way of thinking about how memory works, this is an insight that's due to John Anderson, is to say, well, what happens if we imagine that bookshelf is infinitely long? And the challenge is inserting books in a way that, you know, you don't just give up looking for them. And when you give up looking for them, that's when you forget something, right? It's that it's still there somewhere. It's just that it's so hard to find it that you've basically forgotten it. And that's basically something which is analogous to the problem of web search, where, you know, before Google, there was lots of stuff that we just couldn't find. And as a consequence, it basically doesn't matter if it existed. It was out there, but we couldn't retrieve it. And so we've actually looked at, there are obviously different kinds of cues that you could use for organizing your bookshelf. John Anderson has looked at using history, so like how often you read a book, predicting how likely you are to need it in the future. What we looked at was organization of facts in memory. So taking a semantic network, treating the nodes in the network as web pages and links between things, associative links, like when I say cat, you say dog. Associative links were like hyperlinks, and then that gave us a way of having a network that we then applied PageRank to. And we showed that PageRank is actually predictive of the centrality of facts in memory.
So is that the analog in human memory where there's something going on?
Yeah, so what we show is that if I ask you to name the first word that comes into your head that begins with the letter D, then we can predict that. That's an analog of a web search task where I've given you an incomplete query which is contained within the target, and I'm just measuring the centrality of your responses or the fluency of those responses. That's something which is predicted better by PageRank than by, say, counting the number of links that come into a node in an associative network.
So can that knowledge help search to do a better job?
Well, I think the part that would help search do a better job, there are two lessons that come out of that. So one is the idea of using history. So history is actually a better cue than organization, I think, right? Like if you want to predict which library books people will check out, you're better off looking at how often those books have been checked out than any other kind of information. I think that's not something which is exploited enough in search. If you look at, there are websites that log visits to sites and give you sort of information about the distribution of those visits, and that's exactly what you should need in terms of, if you think about this as a Bayesian problem, where you need to estimate a prior distribution over somebody wanting to visit a particular web page. So, yeah.
There are a lot of human and animal learning things in which the actual order of the stimuli matters a lot. And it seemed to be in the Bayesian framework that's a hard.
No, that's a great question. So that's something which we think about a lot. So I said, when I talked about Anderson's model, I said, you know, one of the things that we can do is we can use algorithms that come from machine learning, and they give us a different way of thinking about how to solve the problems that come up in Anderson's model. So when Anderson proposed this model, he did a really good job of deriving the probability model, but then he got stuck. Because in order to actually do this estimation and to correctly assign things to clusters, you need to do Bayesian inference where you need to sum over all of the clusterings. So you need to sum over all partitions of the data. And that's, you know, that becomes intractable very quickly. You get essentially an exponential increase in the number of clusters. So the way he solved this is just to say, okay, you just assign each one greedily to the most likely cluster, and then you run through the data and do that. And that predicts a very, very strong order effect. It predicts that the very earliest things you see are going to have a huge effect on the way that you form a clustering later on. So what we've done since then is to use this correspondence to then go back to the machine learning literature and say, okay, you guys have a bunch of algorithms you've worked out for using in this model. One of these is a Gibbs sampling algorithm. So that just gives you samples from the posterior, and it's completely invariant to order. So that's not right. It's useful, but it's not right in terms of matching human cognition. But another class of algorithms is particle filters. So particle filters give us it's a sequential Monte Carlo method where you have a set of samples from the posterior which are updated as you get new data. And that, if you've got a small number of particles, has a kind of primacy effect kind of bias, where it does have an influence of the early information which kind of influences the way that you cluster, but you can recover from that somewhat by the fact that you've got multiple representations. So while you might have, you know, a few instances of one clustering, even if you've got one instance of an alternative clustering later on down the line, you can go back and use that alternative instance. And so you're not tracked as strongly as you are if you're just representing a single one. So we've shown that using particle filters in this model gives us a much better account of human learning, where it gives us something which is in between, you know, completely ignoring the order and being completely determined by the order. And that's basically what you see in terms of those order effects. And we're now looking at using particle filters in other probabilistic models as a method for translating those kind of abstract solution to computational problem models into more mechanistic process level accounts of what might be going on in people's heads. So for example, in parsing, you have a nice problem like this where as I say things, you have to be figuring out the underlying syntactic structures. There are a bunch of phenomena there which are basically order-dependent phenomena, things like garden path sentences, where you start off a sentence one way and then people get completely confused about what the sentence is about, right? Like the horse raced past the barn fell, right? So we show there that if you use a particle filter for parsing, it predicts those kind of phenomena because it gets tracked early by the first interpretation and then gets boggled when it gets that, that word which is inconsistent. Yeah.
In some experiments that I've done, the prototypes or the elements that lie close to the decision boundary are the ones that are most important.
Yeah.
So you can neglect the ones that are far away from the decision
Right.
boundary.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point.
So when you
yeah.
do this recycling,
Yeah.
if you also track the boundary, then you can sort of delete the ones that
Right.
are redundant and just keep the ones that are.
Yeah, so so methods that are based on discriminative solutions to categorization problems, where what you're doing, instead of learning a distribution for each of the categories, you're trying to learn the boundary, then you can throw away a lot of data as well. The difference here is that discriminative approaches really work for solving a particular problem like classification, but they don't model all of the data, and so they don't allow you to do things like say, okay, here's a cat and it has, one eye that I can see and 2 legs that I can see. How many eyes and how many legs do I think it has? Well, you're able to do that if you've got an estimate of the rest of the density, and so that's where you might want to keep some of those other examples around. Whereas, yeah, the things that might be close to the boundary are the two-legged, one-eyed cats, right? Which you might not think of as typical examples. Should we do one more question?
It's just a quick one. A lot of the stuff with the categorization and sort of like the exemplars versus the prototypes. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of application for that in language acquisition when you're talking like morphology paradigm.
Right.
Have you applied any of this?
Yeah, so we've used some non-parametric models in the context of learning morphology, and also for learning phonetic categories.
Yeah.
So in both of those cases, for phonetic categories, you have this problem of just how many you should learn. For morphology, it's more of a question of kind of inferring types of, say, suffix relations, right? And that that there are certain classes of words that take certain kinds of suffixes. For example, verbs that become past tense act differently from nouns that become plural, right? So you want to be able to recognize that there are those subclasses.
Or even just like within verb classes, like regular and irregular.
Right, that's right.